Welcome to the Rhetorical Analysis essay. As you get ready for this video and the content contained in the video, you want to make sure that you have any necessary materials in order to take notes, as this video is intended to not only introduce you to the project, but provide you with the information that you'll need in order to begin your first draft. So after watching this video, you should be able to define rhetorical analysis, define what we mean by purpose, audience, and context, and define how to begin the drafting process for your essay. So let's begin by answering the question, what is our rhetorical analysis project? In this 1,500-word essay, you will begin to see the strategies that writers use when composing text. Each text, whether it be a newspaper article, a speech, an advertisement, or a flyer, is composed in an intentional way to achieve a specific goal. This means that it is composed for a specific purpose, audience, and context. This project is going to help you recognize rhetorical composing strategies so that you can begin to use them when you write. So what can a rhetorical analysis do for me as a writer? A rhetorical analysis helps you understand how a text is achieving a goal for an audience. Now, each of us, when we write, we automatically are writing for a specific purpose, in a specific context, for a specific audience. So it's not as if we don't already do this when we write. But what we want to do is we want to recognize how a writer puts these pieces together to specifically achieve the goal for an audience. In so doing, you'll uncover the choices that the composer made and how those choices are serving the composer's purpose. Analysis simply means taking something apart and then examining it. So a rhetorical analysis involves naming the choices you see that a writer has made, and then examining the relationship among the choices in light of the text's purpose, audience, and context. So for example, if you identify the writer's purpose for a specific text, our next question is, well, how did the writer achieve that purpose? What did they do in the text that achieved their intended goal? When we hear the term rhetorical analysis, sometimes it means it's a little intimidating, or perhaps it just seems daunting. But when we think about it in the sense of the term analysis, which is just the breaking down of something into parts, and then interpreting those parts and how they fit together. Analyzing communication, which is what we're doing here. We're analyzing some communication. It helps us understand how texts appeal to the audience. So in other words, it helps us understand how it does what it does for the audience. Studying how others shape their text for their audiences, analyzing them rhetorically, helps you develop your own abilities to shape texts that reach those you want to reach. So in essence, being able to identify in a text how a writer puts something together in order to achieve its goal, we can then, when we write, start thinking about the choices that we're making in a text and why we are doing that so that we can reach our intended goal. In a rhetorical analysis, we examine how authors attempt to persuade their audiences. And we do that by looking at the various components that make up this art of persuasion. Each time we write, it's for a specific rhetorical situation. And so if you see the graphic here on our screen, the rhetorical situation is just a way to put together kind of the complex things that happen when we write. You notice that in this graphic, we have a writer, we have an audience, and we have a subject. But then we see in the middle the text. The text has been shaped by all of these things: the exigence, the purpose, the genre, the audience, the subject, and the writer. The exigence, why the writer is writing about a particular subject. we think about that through this lens of context. Who is discussing this? Where and when is this an issue? So, in other words, why does this text need to exist right now? Or why did it need to exist when it was written? What purpose does it serve? When we think about the purpose, it's what is the writer seeking from the audience? What does the writer want the audience to think, feel, do, believe, or act as a result of engaging with the text? Who is the audience? And how do you know? The genre is how the subject is presented to the audience. In which way, in which genre did the writer choose to compose their text? That makes a difference. When we bring these pieces together, we start looking at how a text has been formed. And so in our rhetorical analysis, we want to begin first by identifying the rhetorical situation, and then we want to think about why the writer made the choices that they did in order to achieve the goal. So let's do this by just kind of walking through how you're going to begin your text. The first thing we need something to analyze. A rhetorical analysis means that you're analyzing a text. And as I said earlier, a text could mean anything from a newspaper article to a flyer to an essay to a chapter in a book to a whole book. For us in this project, our text is actually going to be a speech. You're going to choose one of the 3 speeches you see below. Either Malcolm X's police brutality speech, or President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy address to Congress, or Greta Thunberg's address to the United Nations world leaders. Each of these is already in Canvas on the page where this project is introduced. So you're going to choose one of these speeches. But hang on, because we're going to walk through kind of a process about how we want to do that. So keep this in the back of your mind. You're going to choose one of these 3 speeches for your essay. Before you choose which of the 3 speeches you want to do for the essay, you want to make sure that you watch all 3. And as you watch, develop a page of notes for yourself that answers the following questions. So for each of the 3 speeches, and the reason why I say this is because you really want to make sure that you engage with each of the 3 speeches before you choose which one you want to devote this essay to. So I've developed some questions that you want to kind of be able to answer or discuss for each of the 3 before you choose which one. So what do we need to know about a text that we want to analyze? We want to know first the rhetorical situation. That's the context, purpose, and audience. Then we want to know how the writer put it together. So we're going to talk about the rhetorical peels a little bit, ethos, pathos, and logos. And then we're going to talk about some surface features. That's things like the organization, the structure, and the form. So the first one's going to give us the text, the context, audience, and purpose. What the other 2, the rhetorical appeals and the surface features do, what they do is they begin to allow us to think about how the writer achieved the rhetorical situation. So you've got your notes. You're going to be watching the speeches. Now let's come up with the questions we want to ask ourselves as we watch each of the 3 speeches. So the first thing we want to do is we want to establish the rhetorical situation for each of the 3 speeches. So what's the context? For that, you want to ask yourself these questions. What is the occasion or event that prompted the writer or speaker to compose the text? In other words, why did the writer write that speech for that moment? What's the context surrounding the topic or the issue being addressed in the speech? In other words, when was the piece written? What events occurred in the world at that time that may have influenced the speaker to create this piece? Being able to answer these is going to provide you with some of the context of that speech. What about audience? We need to establish who the audience is. So, who is the intended audience? In other words, what do you know about the audience? What are the audience's preconceived notions and perspectives about the topic or issue? How might the audience receive the writing? Who might potentially be a general indirect audience? And is there an audience that may disagree? If so, who? So when we're beginning to think about who the audience for a specific text, in this case, our speech, we can ask ourselves these questions. So these are some good guiding questions to have down in your notes in order to begin pulling apart or identifying the pieces in the speech. So let's talk about the purpose. What is the purpose of the text? You want to make this as detailed as possible, because remember, if we think about these speeches, each of them is trying to persuade the audience of something. And they do that, they're persuading them to feel, to think, to believe, to act. So you want to make sure you're able to really flesh this out, be as detailed as possible. What message is the speaker attempting to get across? What does the speaker want the audience to think, feel, do, believe, act as a result of watching the speech? So now we start thinking about, we've got those questions answered for each of the speeches. Before you move in between these speeches, you want to list everything about the communication that seems to be a choice. In other words, as you listen, what stands out to you? Are there words or phrases? We won't have colors or images in this case. If it stands out to you, it's probably something that the composer intentionally did. So it's a good place to begin your analysis. But right now, remember, we're just listing things. So once you've got the identified audience, purpose, and context, you also want to think about what stood out to you in that speech. What were some things that the speaker said throughout the speech that kind of stood out to you as aha moments, or things that you just thought were interesting? You want to make a list of those along with the audience, purpose, and context. That will give you enough notes to think about which speech you want to choose. But now we want to think about the rhetorical lens. So if you remember, the rhetorical situation was a way to identify the audience, the purpose, and the context. So it's more like comprehension, right? But now what we want to do is we want to think about, we know what the purpose was for those speeches, but now we want to think about how the audience or how the speaker achieved its goal for the audience. One way we can do that is to think about something called the appeals. When we think about the rhetorical appeals, we think of ethos, pathos, and logos. The rhetorical appeals focus on the writer-reader relationship, or the speaker-audience relationship. So it's the way that the writer has put together a text in order to achieve the goal for the audience. We think of logos as being attached to the text, and we're going to go into these a little bit more specifically in just a second. We think of ethos as being attached to the writer. And then we think of pathos as being attached to the audience. So if we look at this as a way for the writer audience or writer reader or speaker audience relationship, we have to look at how this text was put together, perhaps using a balance of or an imbalance of ethos, pathos, and logos. So let's dive into this a little bit. So when we think of logos, we think of the appeal to the argument, the organization of the evidence. And in order to kind of parse through the logos in a specific text, you could think about these things. What claims does the author make? What arguments or main points is the speaker author making in a text? And what's the evidence that they use in order to support their claim? And that's what logos is. It's your evidence. It's the appeal to the argument. So these are the guiding questions we can think of. These look familiar as we looked at these when we considered the central point of a text and the evidence that was used to support. When we think about ethos, we think about the credibility of the speaker or the author. So is the speaker an authority on the subject? Do they cite authorities and show that they are informed and educated? So even if the speaker themselves is not the quote-unquote expert, do they provide enough data, information, or do they lean on people who are in order to make their argument? In other words, why does the speaker's words matter on this topic? And when we think about appealing to an audience or achieving a purpose for a particular speech or text, the speaker, who the speaker is, will matter to the audience on whether or not the audience will listen to them. When we think about pathos, we think about this appeal to the audience's emotions and interests. And so when we are looking for that or parsing through that idea of pathos, what illustrated examples elicit an emotional reaction from the reader or audience? And what is the result of this audience reaction? How does the author show consideration of the audience's specific interests? And so if you remember that the question that I said about listing some of the things that stood out, the things that stand out to you could be tied to this idea of pathos. It could be tied to the idea of emotions. It could also be tied to the fact that they provided specific evidence or appeal to the logos. Okay, so we have to consider these when we are pulling out information from our text. Here's a quick taxonomy that you might use, or a table that you might use in order to kind of help you pull a text apart to see where some of these things might be playing out. So in this taxonomy, you see that we have the rhetorical appeals, pathos, ethos, and logos. You can find direct quotations that perhaps you would consider to be an appeal to the emotions, so you would stick it there under the direct quotation next to pathos. In the line next to it, being able to summarize kind of the main idea of the direct quotation will help you analyze the quote. How is it being said? So what is it about that you decided was an appeal to the pathos? Was it the tone? Was it a specific word that they used? And then how does that surface feature, which is what we call that, create the desired appeal? So let's say that you heard a specific word or a phrase. Perhaps there's a phrase that the speaker keeps repeating. Or perhaps there is a specific theme that the speaker keeps repeating through different words. What you would want to do then, where it says how do the surface features create the desired appeal, is you would want to explain why perhaps the appeal or the quote appeals to the audience in that way. For example, sometimes a speaker will say, we are here. And that idea of we could be an appeal to the pathos, an idea of unity. The speaker uses we to incorporate that all of us are here together. Instead of saying you all or all of you, the speaker might include himself or herself in that in order to kind of connect to the audience in a moment of unity. And that would be something that you could put in this taxonomy or this grid as a way to begin to analyze those different appeals. So this table that you see right here is just an idea. When we dive into more of that second draft, this will come back up again, but it is something to begin thinking about to begin doing some of the dissection of a specific text before we even get to the point where you're shaping it into an essay structure. You cannot do an analysis or an analysis essay until you've actually thoroughly analyzed the text. And so something like this grid or the notes that you would take on each of those videos is going to be a way to engage with and deconstruct the text before you're able to put your thoughts together and shape it into an essay. And so this week is meant to really take that time to do that. Once you have your notes, we start thinking about how are the choices used strategically? How do the pieces fit and work together to affect a reader or viewer? That's the ultimate goal. Once you're able to pull it all apart, look at all the pieces, you've got to think, how did the writer, or draw those conclusions, how the writer put together the text in order to achieve the goal. So now it's time to choose. Once you have watched each of the 3 videos and done the notes for the 3, you'll choose which one you want to focus on for this essay and why. Now that you've engaged with each of the 3 speeches and developed your notes, choose which one of the speeches you would like to focus on for this essay. You can complete the thinking text discussion board before developing draft number 1. Now, draft number 1 is going to be at least 600 words, and I just want you to use this draft to unpack the text as much as you can. Once you have a really well-developed notes based on the speech that you choose, you can just start bringing it together. Don't worry about the essay structure yet. Use this draft as a writing to learn exercise where you just communicate all of your observations about the text. Just shape your draft to discuss your answers to the following. What's the purpose of the text? Who is the intended audience? And what is the context of the text? Now, that may seem like, wow, that's just a few words. How do I make that into a 600-word essay? Remember, you're starting to think about, if you can tell us the purpose, you got to start thinking about what they did to achieve that purpose. So not only are you giving us the purpose or the intended audience, but you're also starting to pull things out of the text. Do the grid that was on the slide a couple slides back that'll help you begin to pull out some of these things. Remember, this is just the first draft. So the best thing that you can do is just get out everything that you know and understand about this text as it relates to purpose, context, and audience. And then what we will do is we will begin to shape the essay into that structure when we move into the second draft. But now is the time to just engage with the speeches, engage with the text, understand that rhetorical analysis, and begin to get this information out. So please take the time, come back to this video as many times as you would like in order to help you with this drafting process. Other than that, I hope you have a fabulous week and happy drafting.